Major global events can redefine how countries approach national security. 9/11, for example, prompting new security apparatuses and strategies to the tune of trillions of dollars. Will this pandemic similarly redefine what it means to protect one's own nation? With us now to consider that in Tacoma Park, Maryland. She can see Washington, D.C. from her porch. There's Heather Hurlburt, Director of the New Models of Policy Change at the Washington-based think tank New America. And at his home in our nation's capital, there's Wesley Wark, visiting professor at the Center for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa. Why don't we just start with this very open-ended question. Heather, to you first. As we suggested in the intro, 9/11 really did redefine national security nearly 20 years ago. Do you think this pandemic, in its own way, will do the same?
This pandemic is going to redefine a number of things. And I think certainly it's going to redefine international institutions, international cooperation, maybe the international economy. It's a little early for me to say that it's going to redefine national security per se. And that really is a question of what tools do you want to use to fight it? What parts of our societies do you want to mobilize? Which to me is one of the questions that comes up the minute you start putting something in a national security frame.
We will follow up on those questions as we continue our conversation. Wesley, how about you? Has this redefined what national security now means going forward?
I think the simple answer to that, Steve, is yes. It's a complicated question to know exactly how it's going to redefine national security, but I think we're in the midst of and on the brink of major changes. And if you compare the kind of impact of COVID-19 versus the impact of 9/11, I think we can begin to appreciate the scale of the changes that are going to happen to national security institutions and, societal practices across the board. This will happen on, I think, a global scale. It will happen among allies, including the Five Eyes that link Canada and the United States. It will happen domestically. And what I would say about this is that I think the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of its impacts, is not going to be a unique vector for change, but what it's going to do is accelerate change that's already underway with regard to a very different kind of national security environment that we are already kind of grappling with in terms of concerns, rising concerns about things like the scale of foreign espionage, which is really on the rise, concerns about foreign interference in democratic practices around the Western world, concerns about cyber aggression, to that list of things that are changing the kind of basic dynamics of national security and how security intelligence agencies function. I think COVID-19 will come in with great force. And certainly in Canada, it may be different in the United States, and I'd be interested to hear Heather's views about this, but certainly in Canada, up until now, although we have thought about it, we haven't taken the issue of kind of global health security very seriously as a national security issue. And I think that is going to be the big change going forward.
Heather, you want to pick up on that?
Absolutely. No question. The US, Canada, and I think we're frankly seeing many societies grossly underinvested, underfocused, undervalued health security and health preparedness. And in the US, we're seeing that, I should say, both at the national level and at the state and local level. And the implications of that and the fallout from that are going to be long lasting. And it's an interesting parallel to the post 9/11 period where we were successful in identifying a set of areas in which we'd underinvested, and we invested in them heavily. And that in turn created another set of problems and strains, which we're still living with. And I think that exact 9/11 legacy is why I'm so hesitant about the idea of understanding health as a national security issue, which implies, at least in the US context, that you're going to go after it with the full force of your national security establishment, which in the US case is very heavily militarized. And you may or may not conclude that military structures are the best way that you want to go about a pandemic. And certainly what we've seen so far in the US, legislation, emergency legislation, or emergency presidential security powers being used to do things like keep meat packing plants that are centers of epidemics open. It's very, if the lesson we learn from 9/11 is that a security first approach is the only solution. That's, I think, a lesson that's questionable in the 9/11 case and even more questionable in this case.
I might add parenthetically, however, that the Premier of Ontario did urge a few days ago and did get clearance to have members of the Canadian military forces come into our long-term care homes because they are such ground zero right now for COVID-19. Having said that, Heather, I wonder if you could follow up on this, and I'll make the 9/11 analogy again. Just as, what was it, 7 or 8 years before 9/11, there actually was a bombing in the World Trade Center that should have been a heads up to everybody that this was coming. How much do you think this pandemic has been on the radar screens of national security apparatuses in the United States? Because, public health officials have been predicting this one for a long time too.
There's a wonderful parallel there, not just to the first World Trade Center bombing, but of course to the bombings of US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in the 90s. And as it happens, I was working in the State Department when that happened. And very similarly, of course, many who served in the Obama administration are looking back to the Ebola epidemic in 2014, as well as past H1N1 and SARS epidemics as opportunities that were missed to do the kinds of preparation that we were talking about a moment ago, and that I want to say were really, in the US, comprehensively missed across both the national security and the state and local government establishments. Obama administration officials have been very vocal about saying that after Ebola, they wrote a response plan, tried to brief it to Trump officials, who promptly not just discarded the plan, but dismantled the offices and got rid of the career staff who had been involved in it. So we can point both to a very specific and political way that the opportunity was missed, but also really at the state and local level, a much more comprehensive way that our security and international apparatus and our domestic governing apparatuses just weren't connected.
Wesley, how about you on that in terms of the Canadian context? I know Theresa Tam, for example, wrote a report, I can't remember, it was 5, 6, 7 years ago, anticipating this coming, anticipating, I think, more than 100,000 deaths as a result of a global pandemic. How much was that on anybody's radar screen over the intervening years?
I think the unfortunate phenomenon that we see time and time again is that there's an immediate attention, of course, when global pandemics break out and reach our own shores. That's certainly been the Canadian experience, even when the fear didn't quite materialize, as with the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. But between that kind of immediate attention and the next event that might be several years down the road, we go into a period of amnesia. And in the Canadian context in particular, it's interesting to think about the impact of SARS, for example, back in 2003. And in the aftermath of SARS, the Canadian government, it was a Liberal government at the time, put together really Canada's first ever national security strategy or national security policy. And one of the big changes that was implemented or meant to be implemented in that 2004 strategy was to bring health security very explicitly defined into the national security framework. What it was suggesting in 2004 was that we needed more global intelligence collection, including from our own capabilities and from those of our allies. We needed a capacity to report systematically and analyze the potential threat posed by global pandemics. And we needed to have attention paid to these when the collection and reporting was working, in terms of having senior decision makers really pay attention. That system, was created on paper. It was never followed through in practice. And I think we're going to have a sort of back to the future moment in Canada, where we'll look back at all of the ideas that we had over the past nearly 2 decades now and say, we missed some important pieces of preparedness. And in particular, what is key, and I think everybody in the health field will agree, what is key when you're facing a pandemic outbreak, no matter where it is in the world, is that you have as much early warning as possible about how it's going to impact on the global system, how it's going to impact on you. And certainly the Canadian experience, and I think the experience of many other countries, was that the potential for early warning was there, but the actual impact of early warning just wasn't felt. And in the Canadian case, and I think this is true in the American case as well, we lost upwards to 2 months of potential preparedness and planning that could have been put in place much earlier than the kind of scramble that we engaged in come mid-March.
Yeah,
Heather, I take
Steve,
your
if I
point
could.
that, yeah, please pick up on that if
No,
you
I
would.
was
Sure.
I was going to jump in because I think those are incredibly important points, and we see in Asia, interestingly, that countries like South Korea that did have very serious bouts of SARS or H1N1 had the muscle memory to take this seriously much faster and to be willing to take big comprehensive steps much more quickly than we in North America were. And it's interesting because I think the US was even less affected by SARS and H1N1 than Canada was. And so that may, in addition to our dysfunctional politics, explain even further. And I also want to just make the point of something that's a little different, which is that through the Centers for Disease Control, we in the US have traditionally had really, really excellent sources of global information and medical and public health skill outside of our national security establishment. And something that has come to the fore in recent weeks is that in a way that is not solely attributable to the Trump administration, the CDC has been allowed to decay a bit as an institution, and that it's currently suffering from both attrition of top-level career folks and some problematic political leadership and the particular political stresses of working with this White House. So that then leads you to sort of the third point, which is that it's very clear that in the US we had, despite those challenges, we had strong national security, we had strong intelligence information. The president had plenty of advance warning. And it's clear that the president didn't take it very seriously, ignored the warnings that were written into his daily intelligence brief, but also, frankly, that American leaders across parties and across a wide range of American life really couldn't imagine well into March that what was happening in Asia could be relevant to the United States. And that is sort of, even before you get to talking about the national security establishment, a real question of how Americans, and I wouldn't put Canada in the same boat here, how we look at the rest of the world and when and whether we understand outside threats to be relevant to us, which is again an echo of pre 9/11 in some ways.
Well, Wesley, let me follow up with this. Let's say we had better health intelligence available to us in Canada going back. Would we have been warned earlier about the threat of COVID-19?
The answer, Steve, of course, is in theory, yes. In practice, it would depend, and this kind of reflects some of Heather's reflections on what was happening in Washington. You can have good early warning from intelligence or other sources, including from some public health officials and from kind of open source reporting centers like the ProMed institution, which is purely civilian and academic based. You can have all the early warning that you might want. If it's not taken seriously for whatever reason, then that early warning is not going to do much good. Just to bring this back to Canada for a minute, while it seems clear in the American context, thanks to mainstream media reporting, that there were a lot of intelligence warnings and warnings from other sources about the outbreak in Wuhan early on in January. In the Canadian context, it's less clear that we were able to use the existing apparatus of early warning to any good effect. We have an outfit in the Public Health Agency of Canada called the Global Public Health Intelligence Network, which was meant, among other things, to do kind of media scanning and provide early warning, alongside public health's connections to the World Health Organization, which is meant to be another channel of open source information. It is just not clear from the record that we've seen so far, including documents that have been provided to the Health Committee of the House of Commons, that we had any very effective early warning. And this poses a serious question about why not? Why did the existing institutions not function well, quite apart from the question of whether the intelligence community was able to make any inputs, which the government has not been very forthcoming about. So we may have a more ground level problem than is the case in the United States. I think we do need to build a better early warning system using both the open source information and what can be provided from our intelligence capabilities. But we also need to build in a reporting system, and we need to build in a kind of educational function to make sure that senior decision makers really get the picture. I think that the tragedy of this case, and it kind of echoes what Heather had to say in the American context, is that for reasons that will be part of the big inquiry to come, we remained convinced, despite the evidence for a long time, that COVID-19 would essentially be a Chinese problem. And perhaps we overestimated the extent to which these extraordinary Chinese containment measures were really going to be successful. But for reasons that remain certainly mysterious to me, for a long time, through late January, into February, into early March, we simply assumed that the risk to Canada, and this is reflected in the actual assessment reports that were going to public health, the risk to Canada was going to be low. And this was actually in contravention of both European reporting on this through their European Center for Disease Control, as well as WHO reporting. So that, by the end of January, third week of January, the WHO was saying in its kind of open bulletins on the threat posed by COVID-19, and it has risk levels, it was saying, well, the risk in China is very high. It was saying the risk regionally, that is in the China area, is high. And it was saying that the global risk is high. The few risk assessments that were done internally in Canada throughout this period, late January, February, into early March, continued to say the risk to Canada in terms of infections and impact was low.
That was Theresa Tam saying that.
It was Theresa Tam, and she was mirroring, I think, the information that was coming from Public Health Agency of Canada. How anybody ended up with a risk assessment that said throughout this period that the risk to Canada was going to be low is one of the great mysteries of this outbreak, and again suggests to me that a major shakeup is going to have to take place in the Canadian practice, certainly.
Having said that, Heather, we are where we are now, and I want to know from you, I guess, whether you think that we need to be, or I guess America in particular, needs to completely reprioritize its sense of national security now, meaning future health pandemics ought to be the top priority, and chasing down, let's say, for example, terrorists is a lesser priority now. What do you think?
So we've been having an enormous debate for years now in the US, and we're really in kind of a three-way debate at this point. And one side says the greatest national security threat to the United States is great power competition, is China in the first tier and Russia in a second tier. And where that's sort of relevant in the Canadian context is that view of the world sort of assumes that Canada tags along with us, if you will. And we've seen, of course, how that can play out in instances like the Huawei prosecutions. The second point of view says the greatest threat to the US is these transnational threats that don't take a traditional form, but nonetheless are security threats in the fundamental way that you said at the beginning of the broadcast. So climate, health, pandemics. And there's no question that the faction of American leadership that says our entire national security strategy, our spending, our thinking should be revitalized, should be moved toward that, takes some strength from this. But then there's a third faction in American life that says the key threats to the US are out there. This is very much the force that brought President Trump to power, but it doesn't end with him. And this is a worldview that sort of puts together viruses and immigration and nuclear weapons into one mush of there's good and there's bad, there's threat and there's not threat. And so what I think you're likely to see in the US context is partisans of each of those three positions saying, coronavirus shows you that my point of view was correct. And so it's not clear to me that we will actually get any kind of large scale. I haven't honestly yet seen any commentator or any elected official say, you know what, I was wrong. The problem isn't great powers. The problem is viruses. So I don't believe that although, as we said at the beginning, so much is going to change in how the world is organized, what our diplomatic and security landscape looks like, I expect US politics to continue to be kind of stuck in a fight among these three worldviews.
But Wesley, I've not heard the word terrorism mentioned in the last 6 weeks. I haven't heard the word Afghanistan. I haven't heard the word Islamofascism, except when I mentioned it a minute ago. You know, it feels as if, as long as this pandemic is with us, that whole national security view of the past 20 years, it sounds like it's yesterday's news, but, you know, if I'm wrong, you tell me.
Well, you know, I think you're largely right, Steve, and I think, to be honest, it's a good thing. The Canadian national security community has been obsessed for nearly 2 decades by concerns about terrorism. Governments of different stripes have continued to say that terrorism poses the #1 threat to national security. The reality is that not even our leaders in our security intelligence community believe that any longer. As I said at the outset, there is a change agenda underway. You know, the question of, well, what are the most significant national security threats is always dynamic. It's always changing. But the focus is, for Canada, certainly moving away from concerns about terrorism, which will remain, but with lesser attention and lesser priority, to a new set of concerns. This was already underway, concerns, again, about foreign espionage impacting on Canada in various ways, including intellectual property theft, interference in our democratic practices, including elections, the huge issue of cyber threats, cyber attacks, cyber espionage, enabled penetrations. All of those things were climbing the ladder of intelligence priorities and national security concern. I think Heather's right. There are battles over the national security agenda to come, and what will the priorities look like when this all shakes out. But I think the one thing that you can be sure of is that where, certainly in a Canadian context, health security and concerns about the global environment of health outbreaks was not on the agenda at all, it will be on the agenda in a major way. And I think this will reflect some current practices among our allies and some new practices to come. And Canada, in terms of orienting its national security, likes to work within the context of the Five Eyes partnership. It likes to feel that it's aligned with its Five Eyes partners in terms of how we deal with threats, how we think about threats. And so partly the Canadian response, in interesting ways, will be impacted by how our allies start to think about health security issues. Canada will not take a lead on that, even if we might or should in theory, but will be a partner.
We've got just a few minutes left here, so let me put one more issue on the table. And if this pandemic has exposed the vulnerabilities of anything in our societies, it's certainly the vulnerabilities of our global supply chains, especially with personal protective equipment, PPE. Heather, do you think supply chain should now be considered part of the national security issue?
Oh, this is going to be an enormously hot and interesting issue in the US context. I think actually it's going to be one of a set of issues that put enormous pressure on the Five Eye relationships and other allied relationships that we were just mentioning, because again, very much as you just said, there has been also in the US, even before, a desire to reconsider whether we had over globalized, whether it's, before coronavirus, attention was mostly on certain high tech products and defense capabilities. Now you can add PPE and drugs to that list. So, but this has now gotten sucked into this polarized American debate around how you look at the outside world, and can you be, in the US context, can you both favor international cooperation? Can you want strong ally relationships and want to have your own dependable supply of PPE and drugs? And that's going to be a very difficult challenge for the American policymaking environment. It's also going to be very difficult for allies, where up to now, this conversation has been so framed, as I mentioned, around Huawei and around high tech, and to come back and say, well, and then you have also these reports of the Trump administration perhaps trying to buy vaccine companies in Europe, a real suspicion of US motives, which is really not something we in the alliance have ever had to deal with in the past. And that is that conversation is definitely going to happen, and it's going to be very hard to have a conversation that to get to the place that says yes, the US and Canada and Europe and China and India, everyone should both participate in an open global marketplace and be sure they have access to what they need at home. It's very hard to imagine an environment in which we can get to that kind of outcome rather than a beggar thy neighbor kind of outcome.
Yeah, Wesley, I've heard Premier Ford say it numerous times that we're no longer going to be vulnerable to global supply chains. We're going to manufacture all the PPE we need in the province of Ontario going forward. So why don't I get you to weigh in on this and take the last word on it?
Steve, thanks. And I think this is a huge topic. I would just riff on what Heather had to say very briefly by just reflecting on the fact that I think the whole phenomenon of globalization when it comes to the economy is going to be altered by COVID-19 as people find or countries search for a new balance between reliance on overseas sources of supply and markets and a capacity to produce goods internally. I think this is coming around to an important debate, not just on health security, but also on a kind of redefinition of what economic security might be, especially around protecting critical infrastructure, which will obviously include the health sector. I think all countries are going to go through that debate to define a new concept of economic security. It'll be important, I think, and certainly important from a Canadian context, to try and sustain a kind of globalized picture of the economy, and we're heavily invested in the global economy for obvious reasons, given the nature of our production and economy. But I think it's going to be rebalanced by a sense that there are certain critical economic sectors that are going to have to be protected, and their capacity to produce is going to have to be ramped up. We were already there with regard to telecommunications and 5G, around the debate with regard to Huawei. To what extent do we need to kind of protect that sector? We're now there, I think, with regard to health production, and the government has signaled that it's going to submit any future foreign investments or takeovers in the Canadian health, production, healthcare sector to national security review. That's a significant step. And I think what we're going to find is that the countries, including Canada, will go through a vast redefinition of what they mean by critical infrastructure in economic terms and how they're going to try and protect it going forward.
That's Wesley Wark from the University of Ottawa, Heather Hurlburt from New America. We want to thank both of you for coming onto the agenda on TVO tonight and helping us out with this, an absolutely fascinating conversation. Be safe, you two.
Thank you, Steve. Same to you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.